I'd always thought my life with Emily was something solid, like a house built on stone, unshakable, enduring. We'd been married for 12 years, and in that time, we'd carved out a routine that felt comforting in its predictability. Mornings started with her brewing coffee while I scrolled through emails, the faint hum of the TV in the background. Evenings were quieter. Dinner at the table, a glass of wine, maybe a movie if we weren't too tired. She was a graphic designer, freelancing from home, and I worked in logistics, managing shipments across the country. Our days intersected neatly, like two puzzle pieces clicking into place. Or so I thought. It was a Thursday in late February when I first noticed something off. The air felt heavier that morning, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Emily was at the kitchen counter, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, stirring cream into her coffee. She smiled at me. A quick, fleeting thing, but her eyes didn't meet mine. They darted to her phone instead, which buzzed against the granite. She flipped it over, screen down, and muttered something about a client deadline. I nodded, sipping my own coffee, but the moment stuck with me. It wasn't the first time her phone had become a third presence in the room, but it was the first time I felt like an intruder in my own home. Work that day was a slog. Endless calls about delayed trucks and misplaced pallets. By the time I got home, the sky was bruising purple, and Emily was in her office upstairs. The door cracked open just enough for me to hear the soft clack of her keyboard. I called out a greeting, but her response was muffled, distracted. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to her workload. Dinner was takeout, Thai, her favorite, and we ate in near silence. She kept glancing at her phone, typing quick replies between bites of pad Thai. Busy day? I asked, trying to bridge the gap. She nodded, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yeah, just a lot going on. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling while her breathing steadied beside me. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I kept replaying her movements, the way she'd angled her phone away from me, the clipped tone of her answers. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. Just a nagging itch, like a splinter too small to pull out. I told myself I was overthinking it. Emily wasn't the type to hide things. We'd built this life together. 2 kids, a mortgage, a dog named Rusty who slept at the foot of our bed. What could she possibly need to keep from me? The next morning, I left for work early, kissing her forehead as she stirred awake. She murmured something soft, and I carried that warmth with me through the day. But when I got home, the house felt different. Her office door was shut tight, and Rusty was pacing the hallway, whining. I knocked, and her voice came through, sharp and startled. Just a sec. When she opened the door, her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly mussed. Client call, she said, brushing past me to the kitchen. I followed, watching as she poured herself a glass of water with trembling hands. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, a slow twist of unease that I couldn't shake. Days turned into weeks, and that unease grew roots. Emily's phone became an extension of her hand, always buzzing, always flipped over when I walked into the room. She started leaving the house more often, claiming errands or meetings with clients I'd never heard of before. Once, I found her car parked 2 streets over from our usual grocery store, but when I asked about it later, she laughed it off. Must have been someone else's, she said, her tone light but her eyes flickering away. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her at first. Work kept me busy, but my mind wandered. I started noticing things I'd overlooked. Lipstick on a glass that wasn't her usual shade. A faint whiff of cologne on her jacket that wasn't mine. I told myself it was nothing. People change routines. They try new things. But then there was the night she came home late. Her blouse wrinkled, her smile too wide. Dinner with a friend, she said, kicking off her shoes. Lost track of time. I asked which friend, casually, and she hesitated, just a beat too long before saying, "Oh, you don't know her. New client." That hesitation was a splinter turning into a crack. I didn't confront her, not then. Instead, I watched. I started paying attention to the way she moved, the way she spoke. She'd always been warm, tactile, little touches on my arm, a hand brushing my back. Now, she kept her distance. Her affection rationed out like it was a chore. I'd catch her staring out the window, lost in thought, and when I'd ask what was on her mind, she'd snap back to reality with a forced laugh. Nothing, just daydreaming. One evening, I came home early and found her on the couch, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, intimate, not the clipped tone she used with clients. She didn't hear me come in, and I stood there, frozen, as she murmured, "I can't wait either. Tomorrow, then." She hung up when she saw me, her face paling for a split second before she recovered. "Work stuff," she said, standing too quickly. "They're so needy lately." I nodded, but my chest tightened. Tomorrow. The word echoed in my head all night. The next day, I left work at noon, claiming a headache. I drove home, parking a block away, and waited. At 2 p.m., Emily left the house, dressed in a skirt I hadn't seen in years, her hair loose and curling over her shoulders. She didn't take the car, just walked, her steps quick and purposeful. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding, telling myself I was being ridiculous. She turned into a cafe downtown, one we'd never been to together. Through the window, I saw her slide into a booth across from a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a smile that made my stomach lurch. She leaned toward him, laughing, her hand brushing his across the table. I didn't storm in. I didn't yell or break anything. I just stood there, outside that cafe, watching my wife with another man. The world tilted, but I stayed upright, my breath fogging the air in short, sharp bursts. They didn't kiss, didn't do anything overt, but the way she looked at him, the way her face softened, her eyes lit up, told me everything. This wasn't a client. This wasn't a friend. This was something else. Something that had been growing in the shadows of our life while I'd been too busy to notice. I walked away before they saw me, my legs moving on autopilot. Back in my car, I sat with my hands gripping the wheel, staring at nothing. Questions clawed at me. Who was he? How long had this been going on? Was it just lunches? Or was there more? My mind spun through every late night, every vague excuse, every time she'd pulled away from me. The pieces were there, scattered across months, and now they were snapping together into a picture I didn't want to see. That night, Emily came home humming, her mood brighter than it had been in weeks. She kissed my cheek, a quick, perfunctory peck, and started talking about her day, something about a project she'd finished. I listened, nodding, but my ears were ringing. I kept seeing her hand on his, the way she tilted her head when he spoke. After dinner, she went upstairs to shower, leaving her phone on the counter. I stared at it, the screen dark and silent, tempting me. I'd never snooped before, never had a reason to. But now, my hand moved before my brain caught up, unlocking it with the passcode she'd never bothered to change. Our anniversary. The messages were right there. A thread with a contact labeled J. No full name, just an initial. "Missed you today," one said, time-stamped from last week. "Can't stop thinking about you." Another, from 2 days ago. "Tomorrow," the most recent, sent that morning. My throat closed up, my fingers trembling as I scrolled. There were no photos, no explicit promises, but the tone, the intimacy was unmistakable. I set the phone down, my vision blurring, and sat there until she came back downstairs, towel drying her hair, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I didn't say anything that night. Couldn't. My voice was trapped behind a wall of rage and hurt, and I didn't trust myself to speak without breaking something. Her, me, us. Instead, I waited. I needed proof, something concrete, not just whispers and glances. The next day, I called in sick and followed her again. This time, she didn't go to the cafe. She drove to a house on the edge of town, a tidy little place with a blue door. She knocked and he answered, same guy, same easy smile. The door closed behind them, and I sat in my car, 2 streets over, counting the minutes until she came out. 2 hours later, she did, her hair mussed, her lips redder than when she'd gone in. Seeing her walk out of that house cracked something open inside me. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was fury, cold and sharp, cutting through the fog of disbelief. I drove home before she did, my mind racing, plotting. I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not with words, not with tears. That would be too easy, too quick. She'd betrayed me, hollowed out our life together, and I wanted her to feel the weight of it. Not just for a moment, but for as long as I could make it last. Revenge wasn't a word I'd ever thought I'd cling to, but now it was a lifeline. First, I needed to know more. Who was he? How deep did this go? I started small, practical. I installed an app on my phone that mirrored hers. Every text, every call, every move she made online. It was easy enough. She'd left her device unguarded too many times, trusting I'd never look. By the next morning, I had a flood of data. His name was James Carter, a real estate agent she'd met at some networking event 6 months ago. The messages were careful, coded in vague affection, but the pattern was clear. Meetings twice a week, always when I was at work. I dug deeper. James had a LinkedIn profile, a polished headshot showing that same smug grin. He was 38, divorced, no kids. His posts were all business, open houses, market trends, but his ex account told a different story. Late-night musings about finding peace in chaos. Cryptic replies to women who weren't Emily. He wasn't just hers. He was a collector, a man who thrived on attention. That made it worse, somehow. She wasn't special to him, just another notch, and yet she'd thrown us away for it. I didn't stop at him. I went through her emails, her cloud storage, piecing together the timeline. Photos from a work trip last month, her in a hotel room, smiling at the camera, no sign of a conference. Receipts for lunches I'd never questioned. Charged to a card I didn't know she had. She'd built a secret life, brick by brick, and I'd been too blind to see the construction. The more I found, the colder I got. This wasn't impulse. This was deliberate, sustained, a choice she'd made over and over. That night, she noticed my silence. "You okay?" she asked, setting down her wine glass. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the stranger she'd become. "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. She bought it, or pretended to, and went back to scrolling her phone. I watched her fingers move, knowing they were typing to him, and I let the anger simmer. I wasn't ready to strike yet. I needed a plan, something that would hit her where it hurt most. Not just her heart, but her pride, her security, the life she thought she'd mastered. She'd underestimated me, and that was her first mistake. Living with Emily after that was like wearing a mask every day, one I couldn't take off even when it chafed. I smiled at her over breakfast, asked about her plans, laughed at her jokes. She didn't suspect a thing, which almost made it worse. How easily she accepted my normalcy while carrying on her double life. I'd catch her texting in the corner of my eye, her lips twitching upward, and I'd nod along to whatever she was saying, my mind elsewhere, sharpening the edges of what I'd do next. I started gathering more than just evidence. I wanted leverage, something to twist the knife when the time came. I tracked James's movements, his open houses, his gym schedule, the bars he frequented from posts he'd tagged on X. I even drove by his house once, late at night, just to see it again. The blue door mocked me, a silent witness to my unraveling. But I didn't linger. I had work to do. At home, I played the part of the oblivious husband perfectly. I brought her flowers one evening, daisies her favorite, and watched her face light up, guilt flickering behind her eyes before she buried it. "You're sweet," she said, kissing my cheek. I wondered if she kissed him the same way, if her gratitude was as rehearsed with him. The thought fueled me, kept me focused. I started moving money, 2 small amounts at first, siphoning from our joint account into one she didn't know about. She'd never been the one to check the finances. That was my domain, and now it was my weapon. I also hired a private investigator, a grizzled guy named Paul who didn't ask too many questions. I gave him James's name, Emily's habits, and a wad of cash. "I want photos," I told him. "Proof." He nodded, his jaw tight, and disappeared into the city. 2 days later, he emailed me a file. Shots of them at a park, her arm looped through his, then later, leaving his house together, her hair tousled. One image caught her laughing, head thrown back, the way she used to laugh with me. I saved every one. A gallery of betrayal I'd use when the moment was right. By the end of the week, I had a rough sketch of my revenge. It wouldn't be loud or messy, not yet. It would be slow, deliberate, a dismantling of everything she valued. I'd take her stability, her reputation, her precious little affair, and turn them to ash. She'd see it coming, but not until it was too late. As she slept beside me that night, her breathing soft and even, I stared at the ceiling and promised myself one thing. She'd regret ever crossing me. The game was on, and I was playing to win. The days stretched into a strange rhythm. Me pretending, Emily oblivious, and the world outside our home carrying on like nothing had shifted. But everything had. I'd wake up each morning with a purpose now, not just to survive the sting of her betrayal but to orchestrate its consequences. The private investigator, Paul, became my shadow partner. His updates arrived like clockwork, emails with timestamps, locations, and more photos. Emily and James at a diner, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup while he leaned in close. Another of them in his car, her head resting on his shoulder. Each image was a brick in the wall I was building, one I'd use to box her in. I started digging into James more, beyond what Paul could find. His real estate listings were public, so I called one of his open houses under a fake name, Mark Reynolds, a tech guy looking to relocate. I got his voicemail, his smooth voice promising to find the perfect home. It made me sick, hearing the charm she'd fallen for, but I left a message anyway, setting a trap. He called back the next day, and we set up a meeting. I wanted to see him up close, to measure the man who'd walked into my life uninvited. The open house was in a sleek suburban split level, all glass and sharp angles. James greeted me at the door, handshake firm, smile wide. "Mark, right?" he said, oblivious to who I really was. I nodded, keeping my voice steady, and followed him inside. He talked market trends and square footage while I studied him, his press suit, the way he moved with easy confidence. I asked questions, casual ones, probing for cracks. "Long hours in this gig?" I said, glancing at a photo of him on the wall. He laughed. "Yeah, but it's worth it. Keeps life interesting." I smiled back, imagining his face when interesting turned into something else entirely. Back home, Emily was in her office, the door ajar. I heard her laugh, a soft, private sound, and my stomach twisted. I didn't need to check her phone to know who she was talking to. Instead, I sat at my desk and opened the banking app. Another transfer, $5,000 this time, moved to my secret account. She'd notice eventually, but by then, it'd be too late. I also started drafting emails, anonymous ones, vague but pointed, to James's business contacts. "Heard some things about Carter," they'd say. "Might want to watch your back." Seeds, small and subtle, planted to bloom later. That night, she suggested a movie, curling up beside me on the couch like nothing was wrong. I let her, my arm around her shoulders, her warmth a lie against my side. The mask held firm, but inside, I was counting down. Paul's next report was due tomorrow, and I had a feeling it'd be the tipping point. As the credits rolled, she yawned and said, "I've got an early meeting tomorrow. Don't wait up." I nodded, knowing exactly where she'd be. The game was accelerating, and I was ready to push it further. Paul's email hit my inbox at 6 a.m. A dozen new photos and a brief note. "Caught them last night. Motel on Route 12. I opened the file, my coffee cooling beside me. There they were, Emily and James, stepping out of his car at a rundown place with flickering neon. Her hand was in his, her smile unguarded. Another shot showed them at the door of room 8, his arm around her waist. The last one was blurry, her leaving at dawn, hair tangled, jacket slung over her shoulder. I stared at that one longest, the timestamp burning into my brain. 5:47 a.m. She'd come home an hour later, claiming a late client dinner. I didn't feel anger then, just a cold, clear focus. This was it, the hard proof I'd needed. I saved the photos to an encrypted drive, then printed copies, tucking them into a locked drawer she'd never think to check. The motel receipt came next, Paul had charmed it out of the desk clerk. $60 for the night, paid in cash. I wondered if she'd used money from our account, if I'd unknowingly funded her little escape. The thought almost made me laugh, a bitter sound that died in my throat. At breakfast, she was all brightness, chatting about her meeting while flipping pancakes. I played along, asking about her day, watching her lie without a flicker. "Oh, just some new project stuff," she said, pouring syrup. "Might need to head out again tonight." I nodded, sipping my coffee, and said, "Take your time." She smiled, relieved, and I smiled back, knowing she just handed me another chance to tighten the noose. After she left, I called Paul. "Follow her again tonight," I said. "I want everything, where, when, how long." He grunted agreement, and I hung up, turning to my next move. James's business was the key. He thrived on his reputation, that polished image of success. I spent the afternoon crafting more emails, this time to his clients, hinting at unreliable service and personal issues. Nothing traceable, just enough to stir doubt. I also found his ex-wife's profile online, Lisa Carter, a yoga instructor now. I sent her a message from a burner account. "Heard James is up to old tricks. Thought you'd want to know." She didn't reply, but I didn't need her to. The ripple would spread. By evening, Emily was gone again, her excuse as flimsy as the last. I sat in the dark, rusty at my feet, and waited for Paul's update. Came at midnight, more photos, same motel, same room. I added them to the pile, my plans solidifying. This wasn't just about exposing her anymore. It was about dismantling everything she'd built, piece by piece, until she had nowhere to hide. The next morning, I decided it was time to act. Not the big reveal, but a test, a jab to see how she'd squirm. I waited until she was in the shower, then took her phone and forwarded a handful of her texts with James to my own device. Nothing too obvious, just enough to plant a seed. When she came downstairs, I was at the counter, scrolling through my phone, the messages tucked away. "You're chipper today," she said, pouring coffee. I grinned. "Just got some good news. Things are looking up." She raised an eyebrow, curious, but I didn't elaborate. Instead, I let the day unfold, watching her closely. She was jumpy, checking her phone more than usual, her fingers hovering over the screen like she was waiting for something. I knew why. Paul had tailed James that morning, catching him meeting a blonde at a bar. Another woman, not Emily. I'd sent the photo to her phone from a blocked number, no caption, just the image. When she saw it, her face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Everything okay?" I asked, casual as ever. She nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just work stress." That night, I upped the ante. I logged into her email from my laptop. Her password was still the kids' birthdays, and sent a message to James from her account. "We need to talk. I saw you with her." I hit send, then deleted the evidence from her outbox. She'd find it in the morning, and the fallout would be hers to scramble through. I wanted her to feel the uncertainty, the paranoia, the way I had for weeks. It was petty, yes, but it was only the beginning. She didn't sleep well that night. I heard her tossing, muttering in her dreams. At breakfast, she was quiet, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. James must have replied, because she excused herself to take a call in her office. I listened through the door, catching snippets. Her voice low, tense, asking, "Who was she?" I smiled to myself, knowing I'd lit the first fuse. The affair was her weakness, and I'd turn it against her, let it unravel her composure before I brought the real hammer down. By noon, Paul called with more. James had canceled an open house, citing a family emergency. Emily left shortly after, her excuse vague, her purse clutched tight. I didn't follow this time. I didn't need to. The seeds were sprouting, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath her. She thought she was in control, but she had no idea how much I'd already taken away. With Emily distracted, I moved faster. The money was my next focus, our joint savings, the kids' college fund, the equity in the house. I'd been siphoning steadily, but now I got bold. I met with a lawyer friend, Tom, over lunch, keeping it vague. Hypothetical divorce, I said. What's the play? He outlined the steps, asset division, proof of infidelity as leverage, protecting my stake. I took notes, then spent the afternoon at the bank, transferring half our savings into a trust she couldn't touch. The teller asked if I was sure. I said yes, my voice flat. Back home, I rifled through her office while she was out. I found a hidden drawer, locked, but the key was taped under her desk. Inside were letters handwritten from James. "You're my escape," one read. "Can't wait to steal you away." My hands shook as I photographed each one, then put them back exactly as I'd found them. She'd kept mementos, proof of her stupidity, and I'd used them to bury her. I also found a credit card statement, new account, her name only, with charges to places I didn't recognize. More ammunition. That evening, she came home late, her eyes red-rimmed. "Rough day?" I asked, stirring pasta on the stove. She nodded, avoiding my gaze. "Just tired." I didn't push. I didn't need to. Paul's latest report confirmed she'd met James at a park, their body language stiff, her arms crossed. The blonde had shaken her, and I'd bet James's excuses hadn't held up. Good. Let her stew in the mess she'd made. I served dinner, chatting about nothing, while my mind mapped the next step. His career, her pride, our life, all ripe for the taking. I also started reaching out to her clients, anonymous tips from a burner email suggesting she'd missed deadlines, botched projects. One replied, asking for details. I fed them lies subtle enough to stick. Her freelance gig was her lifeline, her identity outside of us, and I'd chip away at it until it crumbled. She'd feel the squeeze soon, and I'd be there watching, the husband she'd underestimated. That night, I lay awake, planning the big move. Exposure was coming, public, brutal, inescapable. But not yet. I wanted her to feel the walls closing in first, to taste the panic she'd gifted me. She slept beside me, oblivious, while I counted the hours until her world started to burn. For a week, I let things simmer. Emily grew quieter, her phone less active, her smiles forced. James must have pulled back. Paul's reports showed fewer meetings, just quick coffee stops. No more motels. I'd rattled them both, and it felt good. But it wasn't enough. I kept up the facade at home. Cooking dinner, asking about her day, even suggesting a weekend getaway she brushed off. "Too busy," she said, her voice tight. I nodded, letting her think she still held the reins. Behind the scenes, I was relentless. I drained the joint account down to pennies, rerouting everything to the trust. I called the mortgage company, feigning confusion, and got the house appraisal updated, higher than she'd expect, locking in my half if it came to that. I also met with Tom again, this time with the photos and letters. "Adultery's a card," he said, flipping through them. "She won't get much sympathy." I didn't want sympathy. I wanted her stripped bare. Financially, emotionally, socially. James's business was faltering too. My emails had spread. Clients dropped him, citing trust issues. His ex-posts grew defensive. Vague rants about haters. I sent Lisa another message, this time with a photo of him and Emily, captioned, "Still at it." She replied this time, "Not surprised. Good luck." I didn't need luck. I had strategy. I also contacted his broker, anonymous again, hinting at ethical breaches. The dominoes were falling, and he didn't even know who'd pushed them. Emily noticed the money first. "Did you pay something big?" she asked one night, frowning at the banking app. I shrugged. "Car repairs. Forgot to mention." She bought it, but her brow stayed creased. The client complaints hit next. 2 canceled contracts in a day. She vented about it over dinner, her voice shaking. "I don't know what's happening," she said. I squeezed her hand, all concern. "You'll figure it out." Inside, I was grinning. By Friday, she was a mess. Snapping at the kids, pacing the house, her phone silent. I watched, silent, as she unraveled. The stage was set, the pieces in place. The next move would be loud, public, and final. I'd waited long enough. She'd feel the full weight of what she'd done, and I'd make sure it crushed her. The calm was over. The storm was coming. The weekend arrived, and I decided it was time to pull the first thread of the public unraveling. Emily was fraying, her confidence shaken by the client losses, her affair teetering from James's distance. I'd kept my mask on, but now I'd start peeling it back, just enough to let her sense the shift. Saturday morning, I suggested coffee out, a casual outing to a place downtown she loved. She hesitated, her eyes shadowed, but agreed. I drove, humming softly, while she stared out the window, lost in her own head. The cafe was busy, packed with familiar faces. Neighbors, her old co-workers, people who'd known us as a unit. I picked a table near the window, visible, and ordered her favorite latte. As we sat, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos Paul had sent. The motel ones, crisp and damning. I didn't show her, not yet. Instead, I leaned in, voice low, and said, "You ever think about how small this town is? How everyone knows everyone?" She frowned, stirring her drink. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled, light and easy. "Just something I've been thinking about lately." Her unease grew, a flicker in her eyes, but she didn't press. I let the moment hang, then excused myself to the bathroom. On the way, I stopped by the counter, where a friend of hers, Sarah, was grabbing a to-go order. "Hey," I said casual. "You seen Emily lately? She's been off." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "Not really." "Why?" I shrugged, dropping my voice. "Just some stuff going on. You'll hear about it soon, I'm sure." I walked off, leaving the bait dangling. Sarah was a gossip. By Monday, whispers would spread. Back at the table, Emily was texting, her fingers quick. I didn't need to guess who. I sipped my coffee, watching her, then said, "You've been busy lately. Everything okay with work?" Her head snapped up, a deer-in-headlights look. "Yeah, just juggling a lot." I nodded, letting silence stretch until she squirmed. When we left, I saw Sarah watching us, her phone already out. The seed was planted, now it'd grow. That night, I uploaded one of Paul's photos to a dummy X account. Emily and James at the motel, faces clear, timestamped. No caption, just the image, tagged with local hashtags. It'd circulate quietly, a slow burn before the explosion. By Sunday, Emily was jittery, checking her phone obsessively. I caught her muttering about some idiot online, and knew the post had hit her radar. I kept my distance, playing the doting husband, cooking dinner, asking about her day while she unraveled. The storm was brewing, and I was the eye, calm and deliberate, ready to unleash the rest. Monday morning, the X post had legs, retweets, comments, a few locals tagging mutual friends. "Isn't that?" One read. "Wow, bold move." Another. Emily didn't leave her office all day. The door shut tight, her voice muffled through it. Sharp, panicked calls. I worked from home, pretending to focus on spreadsheets while tracking the online fallout. By noon, Sarah had texted her, asking if she was okay. Emily's reply, which I saw through the mirroring app, was curt. "Fine. Just rumors." But her tone when she emerged for lunch was anything but fine, clipped, defensive. "You see this nonsense online?" she asked, holding up her phone. The photo stared back, grainy but unmistakable. I feigned surprise, leaning over. "That's wow. Looks like you, huh?" Her face flushed, a mix of fear and anger. "It's not me. Some jerk's trying to mess with us." I nodded, all sympathy. "People are awful. You should report it." She didn't respond, just stabbed at her salad, her fork trembling. I let her stew, knowing the doubt was eating her alive. Did I suspect? Was I playing dumb? That afternoon, I escalated. I sent the photo to her parents' email from another burner, with a note. "Thought you should know what Emily's been up to." Her mom called an hour later. I heard the shrill tone through the office door, Emily's voice rising in protest. "No, it's not true. Someone's framing me." When she hung up, she stormed downstairs, eyes wild. "My mom's freaking out over some stupid picture. Can you believe this?" I hugged her, murmuring comfort, while inside I gloated. Her family, her rock, now questioned her, and that was just the start. James was next. I'd mailed copies of the motel photos to his office, addressed to his boss, with a typed letter. Your agent's personal life might affect business. No signature, no return address. Paul confirmed delivery. James left work early, pale and rattled. His ex account went silent, his polished facade cracking. Emily's texts to him, mirrored to me, grew desperate. What's happening? Call me. He didn't. She paced that night, muttering about fixing this. While I watched, silent, the architect of her chaos. The kids noticed too. Our daughter, Mia, asked why Mom was so mad all the time. I brushed it off, but the fracture was spreading, seeping into every corner of her life. She thought she could contain it, but I was only getting started. By midweek, Emily's world was shrinking. Her parents stopped calling. Her dad left a voicemail, stern and disappointed, which she played on speaker by mistake. We raised you better, he said, and she flinched, tears welling. Her clients were next. 2 more dropped her, citing unprofessional conduct after my anonymous tips. She spent hours on the phone, pleading, her voice cracking. I don't know where this is coming from, she told one. I listened from the hallway, unseen, as her career, her pride, slipped away. James was crumbling too. His broker suspended him pending an investigation, thanks to my letter. His ex-wife, Lisa, posted a cryptic X-thread about karma catching up, and locals piled on, connecting dots to Emily. The photo had gone viral in our small circle. Friends texted me, awkward and probing. You okay, man? One asked. I played dumb. Just some troll, I guess. Em's handling it. But the whispers grew louder, and she felt them. She stopped leaving the house, claiming work from home. But I knew she was hiding. I kept the pressure on. I mailed the letters, James's handwritten notes to her best friend, Claire, with a scrawled message. She's not who you think. Claire called that night, and I answered, saying Emily was resting. What's going on? Claire demanded. I sighed. Heavy. It's complicated. She'll tell you when she's ready. The call ended and Emily emerged, pale. What did Claire want? I shrugged. Just checking in. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't push. Doubt was her new shadow, and I'd put it there. That evening, I dropped the next bomb. I printed the motel receipt and tucked it into her purse, folded small. She found it at dinner, unfolding it with a frown. What's this? She asked, voice shaky. I glanced over, casual. No idea. Yours, isn't it? Her hands shook as she stuffed it back, muttering about junk mail. But the panic was there, raw and real. She knew I was close, too close, and the mask I wore was thinning. I let her squirm, savoring the moment. The endgame was near, and she'd feel every inch of it. Thursday hit like a freight train. Emily woke to an email from her biggest client, a formal termination, citing reputational concerns. She stared at the screen, tears streaming, then slammed her laptop shut. This is insane, she whispered, more to herself than me. I made coffee, silent, watching her spiral. Her phone buzzed. Claire again. Texting. We need to talk. Now. Emily ignored it, but the weight was crushing her. She looked at me, searching for something. Support, suspicion, anything. I gave her a bland smile and left for work, though I just drove to a park to think. Paul called mid-morning. James is done, he said. Fired today. Words out. Affair, photos, the works. I thanked him, then checked X. The hashtag #CheaterCarter was trending locally, with Emily's name tangled in it. Her carefully curated life, freelance star, perfect wife, was ash. I drove home early, finding her on the couch, eyes red, phone dead beside her. What's wrong? I asked, all concern. She shook her head, voice hoarse. Everything's falling apart. I don't know why. I sat beside her, close but cold inside. Maybe it's not random, I said, soft, testing. Her head jerked up, fear flashing. What do you mean? I shrugged. Just saying, things catch up sometimes. She stared, mouth opening, then closing. The truth was dawning, but she couldn't face it. Not yet. I stood, leaving her there, and went upstairs to finalize the last piece. I'd saved the best for Friday, a public reckoning she'd never recover from. Her parents, her friends, her career gone. Now I'd take her dignity too. That night, she tried to bridge the gap, curling against me in bed. "I love you," she whispered, a plea more than a promise. I stroked her hair, murmuring back, but my mind was elsewhere, plotting. She clung to me, desperate, and I let her, knowing it was the last time she'd feel safe. The breaking point was here. She was cracking, and I'd shatter her completely tomorrow. Friday dawned gray, fitting for what I'd planned. Emily was a ghost, pale, quiet, moving through the house like she was afraid to touch anything. I left early, kissing her forehead, and drove to a print shop. I'd compiled everything. Photos, letters, texts, receipts. Into a booklet, 50 copies. Each stamped with Emily's secret life in bold red. I paid cash, then spent the morning distributing them. Her parents' mailbox, Claire's porch, the cafe, the grocery store, even her old office. No names attached, just the evidence, raw and unfiltered. By noon, the town was buzzing. I got texts, friends shocked, others angry. "Is this real?" one asked. I didn't reply. Emily called at 1 p.m., voice trembling. "What's happening? People are saying things. Claire won't talk to me." I kept my tone even. "What things?" She sobbed, incoherent, then hung up. I drove home, finding her on the floor, surrounded by crumpled pages. One of the booklets, delivered by someone faster than I'd expected. She looked up, eyes wild. "Did you do this?" I didn't flinch. "You did this?" I said, voice ice. "You and James. I just made sure everyone knew." She gasped, a broken sound, and lunged at me, hands clawing. I stepped back, calm. "You thought I wouldn't find out? That I'd let you ruin us?" She collapsed, wailing as I laid it out. Every step, every move I'd made. The money gone, her career trashed, James finished, her family ashamed. "You wanted him," I said. "Now you've got nothing." I walked out, leaving her there, the wreckage complete. The kids were at my sister's. I told them Mom was sick for now. I'd file for divorce Monday, take the house, the savings, custody. She'd have scraps, if that. As I drove away, Rusty in the passenger seat, I felt no joy, just a hollow relief. She'd betrayed me, and I'd burned her world down. It was over and I'd won, but the taste was bitter, the cost steep. Still, I didn't look back. She'd made her choice and I'd made mine.